My name is Johnny. Welcome to A Theory of Everything. End of the day, everyone relax. It's actually kind of torture to make the introvert wait to the very end of the day to actually give their talk. But I actually think it's somewhat appropriate today, given sort of the nature of what I'm going to be talking about. It's a bit introspective, so you're a special bunch to actually show up today and help me talk about this. Cool. Any physicists in the house? Okay, I'm sorry in advance. There's like three or four. There's a few. Cool. So we're going to be talking about a theory of everything. This is something that's been rolling around in my head for about a year or so right now, basically referring to how I like to view the software world and the things that I see as my journey from an engineer to a senior engineer and also to a manager, and about the interactions I have with people when I teach people how to code through things like General Assembly and Black Girls Code and things of that nature. And I'm trying to explain things that seem very weird to me, and so this is my attempt to do that. So a little bit about me. My name is Johnny. I'm Recursive Funk, most things on the web. I lead the directions team at Mapbox. For those who don't know, Mapbox is a data location platform. Basically, if you want to build any sort of location-aware functionality within your applications, whether it be turn-by-turn directions, geocoding, embedded maps, etc., you can come to us for that. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. If you want to talk about that, tap me later. So, a brief history of me and like why I choose to like talk about something like this. My early career was in government contracting, and my first job was sort of the J2EE enterprise systems, right? And going to school for college and for computer science, I graduated, I had my fancy degree, I did the whiteboard dance, answered the trivia, all that good stuff that was expected of me, but I didn't really know how to be a software engineer. And so a lot of what I saw at the time colored my experience for the rest of my career. And so for those who, remember Java server pages, I spent a lot of time in those, right? For those who don't know, I heard some giggles, For those who don't know, it's basically just a way to sort of like tie in server-side rendering to Java applications with JavaScript on the front end. I spent a lot of time in those, and initially it just didn't click with me that some stuff was happening on the server, some stuff was happening on the client. It was very, very common to have this really weird spaghetti mutated code that had a few lines of Java followed by a few lines of like jQuery or something like that. And as a junior engineer, this was just like the way things were done. It didn't occur to me that things could be done better. Obviously, I learned at some point that the dynamics of this was not quite what it seemed, but it didn't really change anything. I imagine it's a lot like being dropped on your head or something at an early age, right? You survive it, but it does change you a little bit. So in physics, a theory of everything essentially refers to a yet-to-be-discovered theory that combines all of the things we know about reality, right? So in the macro world, we have things like you and I, buildings, planets, stars, etc., that are governed by classical physics, the rules of gravity, laws of thermodynamics, things like that, right? We all understand this stuff. We learned it in grade school. It's very intuitive to us as human beings. But in the quantum realm, for those who are into the Marvel movies these days, things behave very differently. I don't want to get into like the very specifics of it, but things that we take for granted, such as time, right, and where things are in space. Those sort of questions and observations become somewhat nonsensical at the quantum level, and I'll stop right there because that is not my expertise at all. So the idea is that in one area of the universe, we have a set of rules, and from another perspective, we have a completely different set of rules. They're largely incompatible at face value, but we just have to accept the fact that when you're dealing with certain size, you're dealing with a certain set of rules. A theory of everything attempts to combine them together in such a way that makes it elegant to explain everything regardless of the size. So that's where we depart the world of the physics and talk about software. What do I mean by a theory of everything within software development? Well, I want to talk about, or at least explore, how we can start to unify and unite all aspects of software development. Very, very broadly, I'll be talking about front end, back end. I'm basically referring to servers and browsers, but things today are like very, very complex. In 2018, what the heck is a full stack developer anyway? These are very complicated things. And so the things that I observe throughout my career have me questioning, like, why aren't we more unified, right? I didn't really meet someone who described themselves as a front-end developer until I was almost a senior engineer, right? And I didn't know what this person was talking about. A front-end developer, like, what the hell is that? You write jQuery like 24/7, like, what is that? Not disparaging jQuery. I learned JavaScript through jQuery. But it was very nonsensical to me. It didn't make any sense at all, right? The idea that you would write some code on the front end, then write some code on the back end and wrangle some infrastructure, to me, that was just the way this was done. I didn't see very much distinction about, like, I specialize here or there. And so that's my journey to try to figure out why everyone thought one way and I was thinking about another. So why would I even try to talk about this? Like, why is this even a big deal, right? Well, there are consequences of compartmentalization. We already see them, right? The more tangible ones, siloed teams, prevents good cohesive communication, and obviously it helps us, prevents us from shipping as often as we want, right? Everyone knows that. It becomes really tricky to hire and also train new developers, particularly when you're talking about junior people, right? Having a cohesive way to talk about your systems in such a way that doesn't see people sort of like falling off the ship, as you go along the stack, and people sort of like checking out, right? When I run department meetings and there are people from all across the stack in there, there's been like issues where it's like, oh, we talk about too much front end in this meeting, or we talk about too much front end, back end, or why do we keep talking about AWS in this meeting? It's all relevant to the things that we do. And so that was always the thing that bugged me. Occupational demagoguery, I stole that from a coworker. This idea that like front end is like the easy stuff, right? And if you ever tried to build a non-trivial front end these days, that that's ridiculous. Back end is for like programmers or whatever, and infrastructure wrangling is for like antisocial neckbeards and stuff like that. Ridiculous stuff, but I mean, there's definitely a segment of our population that actually, holds true to these stereotypes. There are benefits of unification. Quite simply, a common language, maybe not specific nomenclature, but a common way of thinking about how we approach systems, the things that we value, the things that we think are important when we're actually building things. It provides an easier path of mobility across the stack for individual employees, people who want to like actually do and work on front end stuff, who've never actually dipped their toe in that world, and vice versa, and people want to go back the other way. And obviously empathy is a really good benefit to all of this. So taking a step back, why aren't we there yet? Certainly ssoftware engineering is not as mature as physics itself, but certainly we've been at this for a while, and there's still a bit of splintering and compartmentalization. One thing that happened is that front end just blew up in complexity, right? We were building stuff. First of all, we had script tags, and then like those went out the window. Then we had grunt, and then grunt was like not enough. And then we had gulp, which was crazy because then we were like using streams all over the place. Then we went to Webpack, and that just got really crazy. And people were like, "This is insane, too much complexity. I'm doing everything in npm scripts." And we like to one-up each other. So then people were like, "Well, I'm going back to make files. Can you beat that?" I know you're in here somewhere. And then transpilers and preprocessors and packages and minifiers and source maps and linters, and it got so crazy we needed to create like CLIs just like help us do this stuff, right? Because all the overhead required just to get a static website up and going, it's bananas, it's crazy out there, kind of feel like this sometimes. Browsers. Well, Browsers are interesting. They're no longer just document parsers, right? They're platforms in and of themselves. Um, you have user interface with HTML and CSS, okay, JSX for those folks. Rich media, I mean, we got this with HTML5 and audio and video. You can do databases in the browser with WebSQL, real-time updates and data streams with WebSockets, peer-to-peer communication with WebRTC data channels, which is really cool, multi-threading of sorts with web workers, gaming, immersive worlds with WebGL. Any 3D programmers in the audience? You folks are crazy. Just kidding, you're amazing. Offline capabilities, notifications, unfortunately, and frameworks that let you sort of like wire all these things together in such a way that's pretty cohesive. On the other side, servers have gotten really simple, right? The abstractions just keep getting better, right? You know, we had hardware, and like VMs, and we started wrangling VMs, and then we threw them in the cloud to make them someone else's problem. And then they were like, well, I don't want to deal with this. So like, boom, we have containers. And then someone was like, I just want to function, right? Which is great. A lot of business logic today can be distilled down into just a few functions, and then you use services for everything else. And infrastructure itself got really declarative. You just tell AWS or Google Cloud like what you want, and they'll just like do it for you. And everything is service based, right? I'm not talking about microservices. I just mean like hosted services. How many conversations have you had where you were trying to choose the best streaming processing framework, and it was like down to Kinesis or Kafka, and then you chose Kinesis simply because it's a hosted thing in AWS and you don't have to worry about it, right? And that's a completely valid reason to choose that technology. So what's happening? Well, front-end was straight up script tags, and now we have these complex build pipelines. And the back-end used to be complex, and now it's just a collecting of functions and external resources. So we've certainly started moving towards each other. Some would say we've sort of walked past each other a bit, but there's still a big gap, right? We still don't like really talk to each other in a way that, you know, is very productive. You can comfortably devote your entire career just doing front end, and you don't have to even think about the back end too much if you don't want to. So why? Why is there a gap? JavaScript. Promises were made, then nothing. Catch my drift? That's it, good night. Just kidding, okay. You all are a smart bunch. I almost took this out. I wasn't sure if people were gonna get it. But there was a real promise. For those of us who were doing this when Node.js first came out, I mean, that was it. That was the end all be all. Like all the JavaScript developers were like we're done. Like we have all the jobs ever. No one is ever gonna hire anyone else. This is it. And it didn't quite work out that way. Frameworks like Next and Nux sort of got us closer, but there's still a lot of work to do. For those who don't know, Next.js is a web application framework that allows you to do React server-side rendering, and Nux is its counterpart on the Vue.js side. Which begs the question, is JavaScript too useful? When you can do anything, people will do everything, right? It's everywhere. Just look at browsers. Not to beat up on browsers or anything, but I mean, JavaScript is all over the place. Embedded devices, systems utilities, it's absolutely everywhere. You can't get away from it. So is it too useful? I don't think so. I think we have a lot of surface area, but I think that allows us to have more specialization, right? One could take a trip in React land and never actually see a server crash. Like that's a thing. People can do that. There's that much to do there. And you can start with writing CloudFormation templates, wrangling infrastructure, and never actually perform a DOM query in your entire career. I feel like the latter is more common than the former. And the fact that you can use JavaScript to do either one of these is absolutely meaningless. It means nothing. So what I'm trying to say is programming language is not the great unifier. Despite all the best efforts of like some really brilliant people out there, and a lot of work going into a lot of frameworks, I just don't see it. I don't see it panning out in my day-to-day work. I don't see it, with any of my direct reports or any of the people I've ever worked with. I still get the same sort of, no, I'm React front end, like I don't touch that Node stuff. And the same thing with people who program in Node, like I don't do front end stuff. I'm not a designer. I'm like, well, that's not really a thing. But anyway. So what is the great unifier? If we can't count on our programming languages to sort of bridge the gap, then how can we do it, right? Aliens. Just kidding. Values. Values are a much stronger conduit for aligning people and technology in such a way that allows us to work together more productively. The number one question I get from beginner programmers is, which programming language should I learn first? Everyone asks this, whether it's teaching a boot camp or a summer camp or just people starting out. Everyone asks this. Hell, my Lyft driver asked me this, right? And my response is like, it doesn't matter. Like, it literally just does not matter. If you ignore factors like geographical location and job market and all this other stuff, it just doesn't matter at all. You could plot all the common programming languages, JavaScript, Python, Go, Java, etc., on a board and cover your eyes and throw a dart, and whichever one it hits, you can go learn that and have a career, right? It doesn't really matter. So what do you mean? What do I mean when I say values? Well, values can really be anything. It's up to you to actually decide that. It's up to you to come to an alignment about what are the things you think are most important when you want to actually build a team, build a system, and think about the things that are going to help you be successful. Declarative over imperative, right? A React component state definition is on the opposite end of the stack as a CloudFormation template, but they feel very complementary, right? You're not accomplishing the same goal, but you're doing it in very much the same way. You're telling the universe, like, this is how I want my application to be. This is the state that I want it in. And then there's some dancing around about changes in state and whatnot, but it's very much the same thing. Someone who is doing one can very much understand the importance of the pattern in doing the other. This is the big one, composition over inheritance, right? If you can internalize a designer's process of creating a composable interface and the process of taking smaller pieces, combining them with bigger ones to create new components, and then taking the bigger components and combining them to create new pages. If you can internalize why that's important and why that's useful, then there's no reason why you can't internalize why Golang's interfaces are really powerful, at least in the way that they implement them. Convention over configuration. If anyone's ever poked around in a Rails app, I mean, you've seen one, you've seen them all, and that's not a bad thing, right? You know where to go to see everything. And it's that same principle that allows you to recognize why an app you created using an Angular CLI is navigable in much the same way. They don't have to be these fancy computer science design patterns either, right? You can say, we value users over everything else, right? And when you groom your team and your company to sort of like think this way, to think in terms of users and what's really important to them, you sort of train people to view the world that way. And so it's not a stretch to say that, well, most of the time a database query, is an act of creating a user experience, right? Most of the time we're optimizing for speed, memory consumption, etc. And you can say, well, that's more related to cost, but at the very same time, what is the consequence of that query? Like, what's happening when it's done, right? There's someone waiting for it somewhere, even if it's not immediate. It goes to another subsystem. That subsystem runs a report, does a thing, a job, blah, blah, blah. If it's not making its way to a user, even if that user is another developer, then I don't know how you're making money, honestly. So what are your values. This is your job. You have to figure out what's important to you, what's important to your team, your company, and the things that you need to figure out in order to make yourselves successful. It's the only way to ensure that you have the right alignment. Choosing a new technology is kind of like hiring a new person, right? Your team is going to spend a lot of time with this tech stack. You want to make sure it's the right one. And you want to make sure, obviously, you get someone who's qualified for the job, but also you want to make sure someone is aligned with your values, the ones you set forth in your company as well. And choosing the technology is very much the same way. You make sure it can solve your root problem, but at the very same time, make sure that it aligns with the values that you've set forth and that you've decided is important. Values as a universal language. Choosing the right values can be a tricky proposition. There's a lot of back and forth about, what people think is important, what they think is not important or ridiculous or silly. One thing that I really like to talk about is one of Mapbox's core values, and that's to debate, decide, and commit. It gives everyone a voice to talk about what they think is extremely important. To have a voice and to be able to have that voice be heard no matter who they are, whether it's a VP or a junior software engineer. Then a decision is made, right? Someone has to be accountable for that decision. Making sure that you have accountability about this is very, very important. And that's not enough. A lot of decisions get made and they get put in a wiki somewhere and no one ever gets to look at it, right? The commit part is the most important part. Making sure that the team commits to this. Making sure that when you go out and you're doing code reviews and you're building things and everything that you want to have go into the productivity of your team always comes down to the things that you've committed to. Putting it in action, that's the most important part. And it's also a good framework for creating new values. Chickened out at the last minute, and so instead of saying like a theory of everything, I'm just going to put my theory. Specialization is okay. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the smorgasbord of JavaScript frameworks and backend programming languages and different web application frameworks and cloud providers and all this other stuff. As long as we don't compartmentalize, that's the part that's gonna be the end of us. We can specialize, but as long as we have shared values, we can communicate effectively and we can exchange ideas. And in this way, we can make each other better. Programming language unification is a myth. Do not drink the Kool-Aid, right? There are a lot of people out there who have been programming JavaScript for a very long time, but have never touched a server. And that's okay. There's just way too much surface area. Even disparate versions within the same programming language is problematic. Look at Python 3 and ES20, whatever. Values alignment is the unifying language that's going to allow us to sort of move this industry forward. And it works for people too. Thanks. Happy to take questions. If not, I'll be around all day. You have a question over here? Oh, here.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that other values in your stacks are related to object-oriented programming or certain value patterns across languages?
Mm-hmm. So the question was, do I find that different values across different stacks are related to object-oriented programming or other values? It can be. A lot of times they are, because that's what I view as like the low-hanging fruit. Because those are the things you can hit the ground running with. You have certain values, because these are things that people take into consideration when they're creating programming languages or when they're like establishing a baseline of like, this is how you're productive in this particular language. And so like, yes, those are the easy ones. I do urge people to sort of think beyond that a bit. And when we start to talk about what's a design pattern and what's not, things get a little bit blurry. I don't know if TDD, test-driven development, is necessarily a design pattern, but it's like something that I would consider a strong value to take into consideration, and making sure that when you're choosing the right technologies, that if that's a way you want to go, make sure you do it in such a way that supports that particular value. Anything else? Yes.
How do you push values from the bottom up? So like if you're not in charge of someone, like how do you, just a member?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, how do you establish values from the bottom up? If you have no authority to tell someone what a value is, how does that happen? That's actually a really good question. A few years ago, when I was a technology director at an agency, we decided that we needed some values for the engineering team. And it wasn't a process where I got in a room and said, like, these are our values. So we went through some very rapid cycles of debate, decide, and commit. It got a bit heated. People have very strong feelings about this sort of thing, as it turns out. But I think it's work that needs to be done. So if this is something that needs to happen, I think that, well, first of all, just because you don't manage people, you don't have any official power, doesn't mean you can't lead an effort, right? You can be a leader without necessarily having authority. In fact, that's the best type of leader. If you want to lead something like this within your company, I encourage you to do so. Like, tell people, like, get your fellow ICs together, like, leave the managers out of it. They, sometimes we're useless. Don't worry about it. Get the ICs together. You all debate, decide, and commit what you think the value should be, because you're the ones on the ground every day, actually doing the work, actually doing the implementation. You're the ones who have to be productive, and so you know better than anyone else, who should actually be doing this. When we did it, I facilitated the conversations. The team actually decided what the values were. In fact, I think that probably best that it comes from the engineers and designers on the ground rather than from management. Yes. Thank you. Right. Yep. The question was, how often should you review your values? That's a really good question. I don't know. It probably differs from company to company. I mean, I suppose you can roughly align it with, say you're a startup, right? I guess you can roughly align it with the growth of your company, whether it's in, investments, or if you've gotten to a new stage of company size. But then again, some values I think should stay rooted regardless of the company size. I think that they should stick around for as long as they possibly can. The way you implement them may change depending on the size of the company and what the company needs. But if you're changing values often, in my mind, that means the company itself is just changing. At that point, you have to decide if you're a different company than when you were when you started. And that's okay if you are, but you have to have a very honest conversation about that. So short answer is not very often at all, because then you have to update the website. Yep.
You have a very set core values. You can't go from like inheritance to.
Sure.
Yep. So do you think that's possible to do?
Oh yeah. And we're probably talking about two separate things, right? So your people values, I mean, that's definitely one thing that you should think about. But I think that you should have a very specific set of values that are associated with how you choose different technologies, and they change at different rates. I think your technology values are going to change much more often than your people values are. I mean, things get rewritten all the time, refactors, rewrites, etc. Even when you're implementing technologies, but I don't necessarily think that that's cause for a change in values. If what you have is working, I don't want to tell you to like run your business differently at all. Yes, in the back here.
What are some of the strategies that you use when bringing on like new engineers to like kind of reduce resistance and promote efficacy of learning these values?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you onboard people to those values, essentially? I mean, it's really important. I mean, you just be straight up at the very beginning. So Mapbox, I think, has probably one of the best engineering onboarding processes I've seen in my career. It's essentially a mini boot camp. And in addition to being onboarded, you get your AWS creds and all this other stuff, Slack, et cetera, et cetera. Values are a part of that, right? And people know what they are. I mean, you don't get like quizzed or anything. At least I don't think you get quizzed or anything. But you get the history of it, and people know exactly what they are and why they exist. I think it's important to maintain your company's history, the onboarding process as well. Showing how you got to a place is as important as the end result itself, because a lot of times it changes your way of thinking. How many times have you dived into a new code base and you were like, why the hell did they do it this way? But someone told you, oh, we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and you were like, oh, I would have done the exact same thing. So I think that's really important. Yes. How do you resolve the conflict between efficiency and communication? That's a separate talk. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there is a resolution to speak of. I think there's probably a balance that we all need to maintain, and that's definitely going to be different for every company. How you communicate. Mapbox is probably more distributed than most companies, but probably not as distributed as, say, like a GitHub or something like that. And so the way we approach communication efficiency is much different. Everything has to be asynchronous, because when you're working, someone you work with is probably sleeping. And so that makes a big difference on the things that we sort of like value in terms of like what we do and how we make sure we communicate effectively. Yes.
Can you establish like goal values at a single point in time? This is the point at which we establish our values, so we just let them sort of for time.
Right. So in the case of my previous employer, that was like an all at once thing, but that was a little bit different. That was a special situation. We were transitioning from more or less a CMS shop to an actual sort of like product development engineering team. And we knew at that time we needed to sort of like abide by a new set of values. But I think that with most companies, this is going to happen over time, because I mean, even if you do it up front, you're not going to get it right. I mean, you don't even know if the product you're building is going to be the same product in 2 to 3 years, let alone the things that you value. So I think they have to change over time. You have to be amenable to it. But I think once you hit that sort of that product groove, I think your values should follow along with that, and you should be relatively stable. Way in the back over here.
What do you think about using these same kind of techniques when you're not really a tech company, but a tech department within a larger company, merging the tech side with the business side?
So if I understand your question correctly, is if you're a small department within a larger company, like how do you use this paradigm to actually, I guess, integrate with the values of the company overall? Is that the question? Yeah. Okay. Very carefully. That's a really good question. I guess I'm sick of saying it depends, but it really does depend on the company itself, like who you are within that company, and what is the culture of being accepting of that sort of thing. I mean, I could think of a couple companies that would like strike you down with all the force, but as long as there is a willingness to actually do this, then another value Mapbox has is JFDI. Can I curse on here? Just fucking do it, right? Just do it. I think what you'll find is that if you're right and if you have good results, other people will follow. When we did this years ago, not at Mapbox, but at the other company, we were just the first. We presented our values. This has no conflict with the company itself and its goals. This is how we're going to do it. And sure enough, people were like DMing me on Slack, like, how'd you do that? Can I do that with my team? And I'm like, yeah, you sure can. And so everyone like came up with their own values. We did talk to make sure that we were aligned. So like, we didn't have like conflicting values or anything like that. But that was very much part of the process. I'd say just do it and watch people follow suit. Yes. That's a good question. How many values should you have? I like 5-ish. I really don't like to get more than like 5 or 6. More than that, it's kind of pushing it. The idea is that values should be whenever someone makes a decision in the company, I think that they should be able to quickly scan all of the values mentally. If you have too many, people can't do that, right? And that's not to say if you have a list of values that if it's larger than 6 that you failed necessarily. It just means that you're going to have a harder time getting people to really internalize those. So I think 5 or 6 is just enough to actually help your employees like internalize this and help them apply it to every decision they make. I used to work at Capital One. I think they have like 2 values, which is kind of crazy, but it's kind of cool because like no matter what I'm doing, like I can always like call up the values mentally. Any other questions? Yes.
How can you use mentally like the interviewing process to go like hire a group of people that you use like an echo chamber?
Sure. The question is, how do you use values in the hiring process so that you don't end up with a homogeneous workplace, right? So I think values are the thing that actually counteract that, right? The other side of that is like culture fit, right? That's not what I'm talking about. Culture fit is like the thing that, you know, brings people in and say, oh, I could have a beer with this person. And so that's when you start to bring people in who are, who look and they behave exactly like you do. Values are much more important because it's not something that's internal to the person. Values are external, right? It's a thing that we all agree upon. It's like objective reality, whereas like culture fit is about like who you are, you know, and that's the thing that's very dangerous. You know, culture fit could be like, you know, I like to drink beer or something like that. Well, you're gonna fit in well here because we have free beer 24/7. Whereas like a value may be something like, you know, we value results more than hard work, right? That's about a thing that you do and a result that you achieve. And so regardless of where a person came from, what they like, what they don't like, how they grew up, how much money they had, as long as they believe in that thing and they can move towards that, then that's great because it has nothing to do with them as a person. Whereas like all of a sudden you're filtering out people based on, you know, whether or not they like Stellas or something, right? Stellas are great, by the way. Yes. Do I have any advice for when the team's values clash with the larger organization? Well, first I would say if the organization already has values, strongly consider just using those. You know, everyone's not going to have the autonomy to create like a subculture and like sub-team values and whatnot. I would say that please try and prevent that at all costs. That's going to cause a lot of problems. But if they do clash, then obviously that's going to force a conversation, right? You know, who's right? You know, if we have contradictory values, then we have to have a very honest conversation about, are the company values out of line with like the people we've hired now and like this is a better way forward? Then that's a conversation. Or if you as an individual team create values that are contradictory, then, you know, I can imagine that, you know, to your boss, you just seem like insubordinate. So a conversation. Anything else? Yes.
How do you, I think, value seems abstract to me. How do you quantify this? How do you
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So the question is, values are very abstract. How do you quantify alignment? That's up to you. So this is hard work. This is not easy. You don't like scribble values down and be like, boom, we're aligned. It's important part of the process of deciding like what things you value and then deciding how does that translate to the work that you do every day. And that's a really hard process. It's like you said, you can't really truly quantify it. It's like trying to quantify a developer's productivity, right? You start pulling these numbers like, oh, such and such had this number of commits, et cetera, et cetera. You can learn something, but you'll never actually learn how productive that person is if they didn't commit code for 3 weeks, but they solved one of the biggest problems. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So unfortunately, I don't have any easy answers. It's a case-by-case basis. Figure out the things that you value, then begins the really, really hard work of figuring out if this actually aligns with what you're trying to do. That's it. All right, thanks everyone.